There is a house in Pennsylvania where the ground is warm in the middle of winter. Snow melts on the lawn while it piles up everywhere else. Steam drifts out of cracks in the earth a few hundred feet away, and if you stand there long enough, you can feel the heat rising through the soles of your shoes. Underneath that house, and underneath the entire town around it, a fire has been burning since 1962. It has never been put out. It may never be put out. And yet, right now, in the year 2026, there are still a small handful of people who call this place home. They are not the only ones. Scattered across the American West and the Appalachian coal country, in deserts and mountain passes and forgotten valleys, there are men and women who live alone, or nearly alone, in towns that the rest of the country has already declared dead. Towns with names still on old maps. Towns with populations of 1, or 5, or 7. Towns where the last church bell rang decades ago, where the schoolhouse still has chalk on the board from a lesson no one ever finished, where the only sound most nights is wind moving through empty windows. Why do they stay? What does it take to be the last person left in a place that used to hold thousands? And what happens to a person, alone with a dying town, when everyone else has already said goodbye? This is the story of 3 of them. A miner's town in the California mountains where the last residents vanished into legend. A coal town in Pennsylvania that the government tried, for decades, to erase, and failed. And a silver camp on the edge of Death Valley where, right now, one man is the only living soul for miles in any direction. Let's start at the top of a mountain, 8,300 feet above sea level, where the wind never really stops blowing. Why do they stay? What does it take to be the last person left in a place that used to hold thousands? And what happens to a person, alone with a dying town, when everyone else has already said goodbye? This is the story of 3 of them. A miner's town in the California mountains where the last residents vanished into legend. A coal town in Pennsylvania that the government tried, for decades, to erase, and failed. And a silver camp on the edge of Death Valley where, right now, one man is the only living soul for miles in any direction. Let's start at the top of a mountain, 8,300 feet above sea level, where the wind never really stops blowing. In 1859, a prospector named Waterman S. Bodie scratched a small amount of gold out of the hills east of Mono Lake, California. It was not much. It was not the kind of strike that makes a man rich. But it was enough to draw a handful of other prospectors up into that high, brutal country, and it was enough to put a name on the map, misspelled almost immediately by a sign painter who wrote Bodie instead of Bodie. Waterman Bodie did not live to see what his discovery would become. He died in a snowstorm that same winter, caught out in the open on a mountain that would go on, without him, to become one of the richest gold camps in the American West. For nearly 2 decades, nothing much happened. A few dozen miners worked the hills. Then, in 1875, a mine cave-in tore open a wall of rock and exposed a vein of or richer than anyone in the district had ever seen. Word spread the way it always did in the gold rush era, fast, exaggerated, and impossible to ignore. Within a few years, Bodie exploded from a scattering of tents into a town of nearly 10,000 people, with more than 2,000 buildings crowded onto a treeless, wind-scoured plateau. There were 65 saloons on a single street. There were dance halls, opium dens, and a red light district that locals simply called the Row. Between 1877 and 1882 alone, Bodie's mines produced gold and silver worth well over $30 million, a figure that, adjusted for today's economy, would place Bodie among the richest boomtowns that ever existed on American soil. But boomtowns, almost without exception, are built on borrowed time. The ore that made Bodie rich was not infinite, and by the mid-1880s the richest veins were already running thin. The town's population, which had briefly rivaled that of San Francisco's smaller districts, began to bleed away. By 1886, fewer than 1,500 people remained. A fire tore through Main Street in 1892, and the town rebuilt smaller, leaner, more tired than before. Then, in the early summer of 1932, tragedy struck again, a boy playing with matches accidentally started a fire that consumed most of what was left of the business district. Bodie never really recovered. By the 1940s, the town that had once housed 10,000 people was down to a stubborn handful of families who simply had nowhere else they wanted to be. Then came Executive Order L-208, a wartime measure from the Federal War Production Board that shut down every non-essential gold mine in the country, redirecting labor and materials toward the war effort. For a town whose entire reason for existing was gold, this was the final blow. Bodie's last working mine closed in 1942. And that is when the story gets strange. According to the accounts passed down by locals and later gathered by historians, only about 6 people remained in Bodie by the time the mines shut for good. And of those 6, 5 would die violent or mysterious deaths within a short span of years. One man, in a fit of rage, shot his wife. In the aftermath, 3 other men in the town killed him for it. According to the old stories, the kind that get told around a campfire more than in a history textbook, the spirit of the murdered man began appearing to his killers, shaking his fist at them in the night. Within a short time, all 3 were dead as well, from causes locals could never quite explain. Is any of that literally true, in the way a court record is true? Almost certainly not in every detail. This is folklore layered onto a real and violent event, the kind of story that grows in the retelling. But something happened. People did die. And the story stuck to Bodie the way smoke sticks to clothing, adding one more layer to a town that was already becoming a legend before it was even fully empty. By the end of the 1940s, Bodie was silent. No mines, no mayor, no families. Just wind, and dust, and buildings full of belongings that nobody had bothered, or dared, to pack up. And this is where Bodie becomes truly unusual among American ghost towns. Most abandoned places get looted, torn down, or slowly reclaimed by weather until nothing is left but a foundation and a few rusted nails. Bodie, instead, was frozen. In 1962, the state of California designated Bodie a state historic park, adopting a preservation philosophy that park rangers still describe today as arrested decay. The idea is deceptively simple: nothing new is built, nothing is restored to its original shine, but nothing is allowed to collapse either. Roofs are patched just enough to keep buildings standing. Broken windows stay broken. Inside the old general store, canned goods from decades ago still sit on the shelves, their labels faded but legible. Inside the schoolhouse, students' desks are still arranged in neat rows, as though recess just started and everyone will be right back. There is a persistent legend that anyone who takes even a single souvenir from Bodie, a nail, a pebble, a scrap of rusted tin, will suffer a run of bad luck until the item is mailed back. Park officials say they receive letters every year, sometimes from people who took something decades earlier, apologizing and returning what they took, along with an account of the misfortune that supposedly followed. Whether you believe in curses or not, the fact that this ritual still repeats itself, year after year, tells you something about how deeply Bodie has burrowed into the American imagination. Today, Bodie has 0 permanent residents. Not even one. The nearest neighbors live nearly 12 miles away, in the small town of Bridgeport. And yet Bodie is, in a strange way, more visited now than it was in its final, dying years. Hundreds of thousands of tourists walk its dusty main street every year, peering through windows at a town that stopped moving the moment its last resident walked away. But not every ghost town in America ended quietly. Some of them fought back against their own erasure. Some of them are still fighting, right now, 3,000 miles away, in the coal hills of Pennsylvania. If Bodie died from an economy that simply ran dry, Centralia, Pennsylvania died from something closer to a wound that never healed, a fire, lit by human hands, that turned an entire town into a slow-motion disaster the government could never fully control. In the early 20th century, Centralia was a real, thriving coal community, 14 active mines, roughly 2,500 residents at its peak, churches, a movie theater, and generations of mining families who had built their lives, quite literally, on top of the black seams of anthracite coal running beneath the streets. By the 1960s, most of the deep mines had been played out or abandoned, but well over 1,000 people still called Centralia home. It was a working-class town, tired but stable. Nothing about it suggested it was on the verge of becoming one of the most famous ghost towns in American history. Then, in May of 1962, the Centralia Borough Council authorized what should have been a routine, almost mundane task, burning trash at the town landfill to clear it out ahead of Memorial Day. It was something towns across Appalachia did constantly. Nobody thought twice about it. But this particular landfill sat inside an old strip mining pit, and at the bottom of that pit, hidden beneath the trash, was a gap in the clay barrier that was supposed to seal it off from the mines below, a hole roughly 15 feet wide that had never been properly filled. Burning material fell through that gap and into the abandoned coal tunnels underneath the town. And down there, in the dark, it found something it should never have reached, an exposed vein of coal. For the first few days, nobody realized what had happened. Firefighters extinguished what they believed was the fire, only to watch flames reappear days later, and then again a week after that. Bulldozers and rakes eventually uncovered the truth. The fire had found a direct pathway into the labyrinth of century-old mining tunnels that zigzagged beneath the entire town, tunnels that offered it an almost unlimited supply of fuel. By the time anyone understood the scale of the problem, the fire was already burning far below the reach of any hose or shovel. For years, life in Centralia continued almost as though nothing serious had happened. Some residents even joked that they no longer needed to shovel snow off certain sidewalks, because the ground beneath them stayed warm. A few grew tomatoes through the winter in soil heated from below. It felt, for a while, like a strange but manageable inconvenience rather than a slow-moving catastrophe. Then came Valentine's Day, 1981. A 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski was playing in his grandmother's backyard on Locust Avenue when the ground simply opened beneath him. In an instant, he was falling into a steaming sinkhole that plunged more than 150 feet straight down into the burning mine. As he fell, Domboski managed to grab hold of exposed tree roots along the wall of the hole, and he clung there, suspended above the fire, until his older cousin was able to reach down and pull him back to the surface. When investigators tested the air rising out of that sinkhole afterward, they found lethal concentrations of carbon monoxide. Had Domboski lost his grip and gone all the way down, there is no realistic chance he would have survived. The story made national news within days, and it did something that a decade of scientific warnings and gradually worsening symptoms had never fully accomplished. It forced the state of Pennsylvania and the federal government to publicly admit the scale of what was happening beneath Centralia. Studies that followed estimated the fire covered thousands of acres underground and could plausibly burn for another 250 years if left alone. In the 1980s, the government made its decision. Rather than attempt an almost impossibly expensive extinguishing operation, Congress opted to buy out the residents and relocate them instead. Hundreds of homes were purchased and demolished. Streets were abandoned. In 1992, Pennsylvania went further, using eminent domain to condemn every remaining structure in the borough. 10 years later, the federal government revoked Centralia's zip code entirely, a strange, almost symbolic final blow, as if erasing the mailing address could erase the town itself. But a small group of residents refused to leave. They had grown up in these homes. Some of their families had lived on this land for generations, going back to the earliest mining days of the 1860s. They did not accept that a fire underground gave the state the right to take what was theirs, and they fought back the only way available to them, in court. The legal battle dragged on for the better part of 2 decades. Finally, in the early 2010s, a settlement was reached. A handful of residents, the exact number has varied over the years as people have passed away, but it hovered around 5 to 8, were granted what amounts to life estates. They are legally permitted to remain in their homes for as long as they live. They cannot sell the property. They cannot pass it down to their children. When the last of them dies, ownership of every remaining parcel in Centralia reverts, permanently, to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Think about what that actually means for the people living there right now. They are not simply residents of a small town. They are, quite literally, living out a legally defined countdown. Every one of them knows, with total certainty, that Centralia's human story ends with them. There will be no next generation. No new family moving in down the street. When they are gone, the town is gone, permanently, by law. And still, beneath their feet, the fire keeps burning. The Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection continues to monitor it through a network of boreholes and temperature sensors scattered across what is now an estimated 3,000 to 4,000 acres of underground terrain. Steam still rises from cracks in the old highway, a stretch of abandoned roadway so heavily marked with decades of visitor graffiti that it eventually earned its own nickname among urban explorers. Pennsylvania officials eventually buried that section of road entirely, partly to stop the flow of tourists trekking out to see it. It didn't fully work. People still come. Centralia has become something almost impossible to categorize, not quite a ghost town, because people still live there, and not quite a living town, because its ending has already been written and notarized. Centralia's fire, and the handful of families who refused to be erased along with it, eventually became so well known that it helped inspire the fictional cursed town at the center of the Silent Hill video game and film franchise, a strange kind of immortality for a place the government spent 30 years trying to make disappear. So Bodie died and was preserved. Centralia is dying, slowly, on a government-mandated timeline, while a handful of people waited out in the only homes they've ever known. But what about a ghost town that someone chooses to move back into, on purpose, in the 21st century? 8 miles up a winding dirt road above the floor of Owens Valley, on the edge of Death Valley National Park, sits the remains of Cerro Gordo, Spanish for Fat Hill, a nod to the enormous wealth that once came out of the ground there. In the 1860s and 1870s, Cerro Gordo was one of the richest silver mining districts in the entire state of California, at its peak home to roughly 4,000 residents crammed into around 400 buildings, all perched above mine shafts that would eventually produce silver and lead worth, by some estimates, $500 million in today's money. Like every mining boomtown before and since, Cerro Gordo's fortune had an expiration date. As the richest veins played out through the early 20th century, the population drained away almost as fast as it had arrived. By the 1930s, the town was effectively abandoned, passed between a succession of private owners over the following decades, most of whom did little more than maintain the property and occasionally allow curious visitors to wander through. Then, in July of 2018, fittingly, on Friday the 13th, a 34-year-old entrepreneur named Brent Underwood, along with a business partner, purchased all 380 acres of Cerro Gordo for $1.4 million. Underwood was not a miner, and he was not from the area. He had run a hostel in Brooklyn and another in Austin, Texas, and by his own account he poured nearly everything he had, his life savings, plus money from friends, clients, and outside investors, into buying a town that had been dead for the better part of a century. The plan was straightforward on paper: restore the old buildings, preserve the site's history, and eventually open it to tourists as a kind of living museum of the American mining frontier. Then, in the spring of 2020, the world shut down. Underwood had traveled up to Cerro Gordo expecting to stay for a few weeks while the town's longtime caretaker went home to be with his wife during the pandemic. Those few weeks turned into 6 months. Then longer. As lockdowns dragged on and his professional ties to city life dissolved, Underwood found himself becoming something almost nobody in modern America ever truly becomes: the sole living resident of an entire town. He was not completely alone. Several cats and a small handful of goats kept him company, animals that had either been left behind by previous caretakers or that wandered in from the surrounding hills. But in terms of human contact, for long stretches of time, there was simply no one. His internet connection ran off a battery-powered router that occasionally overheated in the mountain cold. Supplies had to be hauled up the same rough dirt road that once carried silver or down to the valley floor. In interviews given during that period, Underwood described the strange, disorienting quiet of hearing a sound in the distance and realizing, in that instant, that there was no one else for miles who could have made it: no neighbor, no passerby, nothing except him and an empty town holding 150 years of other people's memories. Disaster struck again in June of 2020, when the town's historic American hotel, one of Cerro Gordo's most significant surviving structures, burned to the ground in a fire whose cause was never fully resolved. For a man who had already sunk everything he owned into this project, watching one of its centerpiece buildings collapse into ash might have been the moment most people would have packed up and gone home for good. Underwood stayed. In the years since, Cerro Gordo has slowly transformed from an accident of pandemic isolation into something closer to Underwood's original vision. Restoration work continues on the surviving buildings, a small rotating crew occasionally joins him on site, and Underwood has documented the entire strange journey on YouTube and social media, turning what could have been a private, forgotten struggle into a story followed by millions of people. In 2024, he published a best-selling memoir about the experience, recording part of the audiobook 900 Feet Underground, inside one of Cerro Gordo's original silver mines, perhaps the only audiobook in publishing history narrated from inside a 19th-century mine shaft. When asked, in one interview after another, why he stays, why anyone would choose total isolation, crumbling infrastructure, and constant physical labor over an ordinary, comfortable life in a city, Underwood has offered some version of the same answer each time. This place, he says, has become more of a home to him than anywhere else ever was, in part because he has watched his own effort, brick by brick, keep it from disappearing entirely. Somewhere between the loneliness and the labor, Cerro Gordo stopped being an investment and became, in his words, the only place he actually wants to be. 3 towns. 3 very different kinds of ending. Bodie, where the last resident simply walked away and left an entire town frozen in time, preserved today with 0 human residents at all. Centralia, where a fire nobody could extinguish forced almost everyone out, except for a small group who fought the state of Pennsylvania for the legal right to die in the homes they grew up in. And Cerro Gordo, where one man, alone on a mountainside above Death Valley, chose isolation on purpose, betting everything he had that a dead town was still worth saving. Across the American West and the coal hills of Appalachia, there are dozens more places like these, mining camps, railroad towns, farming communities gutted by drought or economic collapse, all of them slipping, year by year, further out of living memory. Most ghost towns in America do not get a park ranger, or a best-selling memoir, or national news coverage. Most simply fade, board by board, until nothing remains but a name on an old map and maybe a single, crumbling chimney standing alone in a field where a town used to be. But in a small number of these places, someone stays. Someone refuses to let the town die completely quiet, completely unwitnessed. And in staying, they become something more than just a resident. They become the last living link between a town's crowded, noisy past and whatever comes after it, the final witness to a place that everyone else has already agreed to forget. Somewhere in Pennsylvania tonight, the ground beneath a handful of houses is still warm. Somewhere above Death Valley, a man is checking on a battery-powered router in a 150-year-old silver town, alone except for a few cats and goats. And somewhere in the Sierra Nevada mountains, wind is moving through the empty windows of a schoolhouse where the desks are still arranged in neat rows, waiting for students who left generations ago and are never coming back. If you were the last person left in a dying town, the very last one, with the power to leave at any time, would you stay, or would you go? Tell us what you would choose, and why, in the comments below.